Welcome to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Whether you're 25 or 45, there's bound to be a discussion that you care about. Our mission is to share practical ways to find God in your everyday life. And now let's join today's host, Rick Mann.
How many times have you stopped at a red light only to have your faith ridiculed or mocked by someone? Now, I'm not talking about someone actually walking up to your car window and making fun of you. What I'm referring to is how many of you have seen those little condescending bumper signs on someone's car of the Darwin fish? You know, the one where they've taken the Christian fish symbol and put legs on it and then write Darwin in the middle, proclaiming both their belief and then mocking mine at the same time. Well, besides harboring a secret desire to crash into their car and drive away, what I really wish I could do is simply point to something and say, hey, look at that. Here is physical evidence that God exists. This proves that God created the universe, created the earth, and then created us. But, you know, it can sometimes be very frustrating trying to reconcile the Christian faith perception of our world with the scientific views of non-Christians. Hi, I'm Rick Mann. I'm this week's Hope on Fire host, and we are concluding our two-part series on creation science. And time permitting today, we're going to be discussing such topics as dinosaurs, carbon dating, ice ages, and the debate over intelligent design. Joining me in the studio again is my Hope on Fire co-host, Chris Lang.
Hey,
Chris,
Rick.
welcome.
It's great to be here. A lot of topics to go over today.
Yeah, we got a lot to cover. And my contributing editor for this series is Dave Johnson. Dave, welcome.
Glad to be back.
And Dr. David Gentry, who has been studying evolution, I should say creation science and debunking evolution science for quite a while now, along with your father. Thank you for joining us for part two here on the creation science
Glad to be
series.
here, Rick.
You know, we have a lot to cover, and, you know, I just want to jump right in. Let's talk about dinosaurs. It sounds like it could be a name of a song or something, but basic question, did dinosaurs exist? Let me just throw that out at you.
Absolutely. Dinosaurs existed. There's no real serious question as to whether dinosaurs existed. Where the controversy comes in, of course, is why were there dinosaurs, or where did dinosaurs come from, and where are they now?
Right, right. Well, let me ask you this. One theory that I've heard about where dinosaurs came from was that the antediluvians, or the people that actually lived prior to the flood, maybe had a hand in that. Is that true, or is that a theory, or you know, how do we take a look at that?
Well, Rick, I think the thing that we need to do here is, again, go back to the Bible and to try to use the Bible as a framework to understand, since we are believers in the Bible, it does help to go back to the Bible and use the Bible as a framework to try to understand what exactly might have happened. Now, after that first curse where Adam and Eve fell and God cursed the ground, the thorns and the thistles were to be part of the fruits of the ground, it does appear that God gave the devil, the serpent, the original deceiver, a measure of power that he did not originally have at the beginning of creation. Adam gave over his princeship of the world to the devil, and in the process of doing that, the devil was given a freedom, a certain freedom to now do certain things to manipulate the original creation that he did not have before. And I think that when we think about the genetic manipulations that were caused not only to the plant life but also to the animal life, that there could have been very conceivably genetic alterations in the original animal kind that over the course of hundreds and up to thousands or 1,500 years after the time of creation, that, and you have to remember that the devil was, his intellect far exceeded any, of course, human that ever lived. He was, of course, made as close to God as God could make him and still be a created being. Mm-hmm. So we're dealing with someone who had a mastermind that was able, that probably understands more about genetic code and genetic manipulations than all of our knowledge today put together. So where did the dinosaurs come from? In a conjecture that, of course, I wasn't there, but...
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. This is a young adult show, so I'm glad we don't have someone that's 4,000 years old on the show.
But I think it's interesting to note that perhaps the devil did have a hand in causing the original animal kingdom to be altered. And I don't think that's too far out to take that view.
Well, certainly from a Christian standpoint, no matter who we believe did it or that it was done, we certainly believe that there was changes made to the animal kingdom that even exists today. You know, in terms of predation with the lions, for example. We obviously don't believe that in the Garden of Eden that predation existed, that animals hunted other animals. So obviously those things had to change. Viruses and bacteria that parasitic problems that attack us today all were added post Eden time. So whoever did it, obviously that helps support what you're saying as well, be it dinosaurs or even what we know as modern animals.
Well, in the modern day, we know how to crossbreed animals, and that's not been that's not a real great revelation to people living in our modern day. And back then, according to scriptures, people lived almost 1,000 years. So there's a lot of learning that goes on even in 100 years for those of us who live that long.
Right. I think sometimes we underestimate the giant intellect of the people that lived back then, and how much more superior to us than we are, and even how much more superior that the devil himself was to those people in intellect and the ability to manipulate the original creation.
Now, in prepping for the show, one thing that you mentioned was there are people that actually believe that maybe, I should say creation scientists who believe that maybe dinosaurs even existed after the flood. Why would they believe that, and why wouldn't we, believe in that now?
Well, I think that it's always been a hard question, where did the dinosaurs go? And there's no real clear indication from the Bible where the dinosaurs went. Now, from an inference, we can take that God saw in his best judgment that some of the confused species that were part of that genetic manipulation that I believe occurred after the fall, that the devil was involved in creating animals like the dinosaurs, that God saw in his best judgment that animals of that species, of the confused species, would not be allowed onto the ark. Now, this, of course, is conjecture, but it does stand to reason that after the flood, that there's really no evidence that dinosaurs existed. Of course, there's no firm evidence that dinosaurs exist today. And as to why some creationists believe that that dinosaurs still exist today, I haven't really researched that enough to give a really good answer to that.
I mean, from a common sense standpoint, you wouldn't think that there'd be these T-Rexes trouncing around after the flood and eating the only people that were left to fill the earth with more people.
Exactly.
Right?
You have to remember that some of these dinosaurs would, in fact, have been a threat to the survival of man after the flood. You had 8 people leaving the ark, and a couple of dinosaurs could have, finished them off without any problem. So I think that it does make common sense as well as, logistical sense that God, in his providence, did not allow them onto the ark.
I just think it's funny to think of a little T-Rex coming up and taking Noah away or something. It just doesn't ring true.
And if you look at the biblical account of the specifications of the size of the ark, and all of the animals, the creation coming in 2 by 2, it's not fathomable that you could fit any normal huge dinosaur inside the specs of that ark.
Right.
Well, I might add a point in here, too, from a non-scientist standpoint, that we say that all the dinosaurs are extinct. But I mean, there's certainly animals that exist today that were part of the dinosaur period. I'm thinking of some of the big bones like the giant sea turtles and these large crocodilians that I've seen. We talked about on our last program that at the very end that because of the way that the changes have occurred in the earth after the flood, the humans, as we believe, live a lot less longer than they did. They're a lot shorter in stature than they were. So it's reasonable to think that some of those same changes could have occurred in the animal kingdom that we see that still exists today.
Sure. And I think that's true. I think that the ability that the devil had after the flood was limited by the materials that he had to work with at that point.
Well, let's go into another thing that kind of catches people off guard, I guess, or is one of the things that evolutionists and a non-creationist viewpoint really come down on people like us or Christians come down on us, is the idea of carbon dating, that they have a scientific method to look at something and scientifically date it to be millions and millions and millions of years old, which obviously flies contrary right into the face of a young Earth theory. Can you give us maybe a simplified explanation of what carbon dating is and then what the problems are with it?
Absolutely. Carbon dating, carbon-14 dating, of course, starts with cosmic rays. Cosmic rays come into the atmosphere, interact with via spallation reaction with carbon, with nitrogen or oxygen, forming neutrons, thermalized neutrons, which interact with nitrogen-15, which gives off nitrogen-15 plus a neutron yields carbon-14 plus a proton. Carbon-14 then is added to the oxygen, making a radioactive oxygen, which is then taken up by the plants and the animal life and also humans. And the rate at which that carbon-14 is taken up by the animal life and plant life and so forth is, of course, in proportion to the amount of carbon-14 which is being generated in the atmosphere at any given point in time. The problem comes, of course, then to finish out that thought, that person or plant or animal is then buried. Their rate of accumulation of carbon-14 ceases. They then become a clock. That carbon-14 which they ingested in their lifetime begins to slowly decay at a specified the carbon-14 half-life, 5,700 years. It begins to decay, and they then can be used as a type of clock, you know. But what are the assumptions that we use in order to use people or plants or other organic matter that has ingested carbon-14 in their lifetime, subsequently buried, ceased to ingest carbon-14? We have to assume that the rate of carbon-14 abundance in the atmosphere which existed at the time that person or plant lived was the same as it is today. And of course, these assumptions that people make, that the scientists make, are based on a uniformitarian model. The uniformitarian model does not work well in our creationist model. Why? Because we have things like creation. We have things like the flood. The flood
changed the whole atmosphere.
Supernatural
events that were not part of a uniformitarian assumption. The atmosphere before the flood certainly did not have the same isotopic abundance of carbon-14 that our atmosphere today has. It has, in fact, probably much less carbon-14. So, plants, people, animals that lived prior to the time of the flood ingested a much lesser amounts of carbon-14. And if you were to try to date those organic materials that lived prior to the flood, they would appear very, very old because the abundance of carbon-14 prior to the flood was much less.
So the idea being, or the assumption by evolutionists, that because there's not much carbon-14 in those materials, they must be millions of years old?
That they look at that and they see the daughter products and they say, you know this really looks really old. But of course, the assumptions they use to come to that point are, I think, not
they're flawed.
They're not valid.
So I mean, carbon-14 is still a useful way of dating maybe more recent. Like if they find bones of an Indian civilization in South America that maybe was 200 or 300 years old, do they find that to be more accurate for those kind of time measurements?
Yeah, I think that's true. Even in post-flood organic materials, there's still some
like Egyptian mummies and
there's still
things like that.
there's still a lot of assumptions you have to make, but yet it is a little more accurate for post-flood artifacts.
Okay.
Well, this is a great and interesting conversation, and we have a lot more to cover after the break. Stay tuned. We'll be talking about ice ages and intelligent design. This is Hope on Fire. Welcome back to Hope on Fire. We are in the tail end of a two-part discussion on creation science. And, we've covered a lot of information. We have just a little bit more to cover. Right before the break, Dr. David, we were talking about carbon dating. And during the break, I asked you a question, and I figured maybe all of us would want to know the answer. Carbon dating, that can only happen, it seems like from your explanation, it can only really take place on living things. Is that true?
Right. You have to be able to utilize photosynthesis or, respiration. And so that's really for the organic matter.
Oh, okay. So it seems like I've heard, or maybe I'm just remembering incorrectly, that they've carbon dated these rocks, or they've taken a look at these fossils and said, well, these things must be millions of years old, or even bones that still exist. Have they been fossilized at all? I mean, where are they getting the material from, and are they really carbon dating rocks?
Right. Carbon-14, of course, is not really accurate, in any conventional sense of the word, past 40 or 50,000 years. So the millions of years that you hear people referring to are hundreds of millions of years, and the fossils in these layers, of course, would rely on radiometric dating techniques based upon uranium, lead, and potassium argon. These radiometric dating techniques also, of course, use assumptions, which we really haven't talked about. But we've concentrated on the evidences that we see that basically call into question those assumptions and actually support a young age for these materials.
Wow. Well, let's move on to another topic that I know, again, gets a lot of people hung up on, again, because evolutionists and other people refer to these ice ages that have happened several times and over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And, you know, the point to evidences of, say, the Grand Canyon as evidence of an ice age or a receding ice or a cutting ice action. You know, can you maybe explain what conventional science teaches about ice ages and then how maybe the viewpoint of a young Earth is different from that?
Well, I think that conventional science looks at the ice ages as something that did happen in the remote past, within hundreds of millions of years ago. Over eons of time, the ice sheets, you know, came down as far as North America and even part of the continental United States. And I don't have any problem with these you know, clues from science, the actual physical evidences of you know, the actions of the glaciers and so forth. That is never really what's been in question. The question is, what is the time frame for these things to have happened? And of course, coming again from the creationist standpoint, we look at the time period immediately post-flood.
Okay.
The tremendous climactic changes we feel that were caused in the post-flood world. Possibly, we're not sure exactly what all could have happened at that time, but there could have been anything. There's been evidences of magnetic pole reversals. We don't necessarily believe that the Earth was flipped back and forth on its axis, but it probably is reasonable to believe that the Earth might have been shifted on its axis at the time of the flood, which caused tremendous global climactic changes in the post-flood world, which basically took could have taken hundreds of years to stabilize. And in the process of stabilizing, the polar ice caps formed. The unequal heating of the Earth's surface was created at that time, causing the weather patterns, the unstable weather patterns that we have now. We believe that the weather existing prior to the flood was a uniform weather pattern that God, of course, had created from the time that the world was, when it was first brought forth from creation. Didn't have all these tremendous terrible weather patterns that we see now, unpredictable weather patterns.
You wouldn't have like a hurricane hitting the Garden of Eden, basically, is what you're saying.
Exactly. But all bets are off after the flood, when the Earth was changed dramatically, perhaps even tilted on its axis.
Well, you know, that's interesting because, I mean, if I were to go and maybe tell a coworker who is, you know, an agnostic or doesn't believe in God and believes in an evolutionary model, and I would say, well, the flood caused this, you know, he's just going to kind of look at me and go, well, you know, that's just the supernatural event, and you're pointing to it that maybe flies in the face of evidence. But I mean, can we come back and say, well, we don't have evidence of what might have happened if this happened to a planet? I mean, you know, we don't have a frame of reference for this. I mean, you know,
really
I think about what like climatologists are saying now about the heating of the Earth and what we think is going to happen. But it's just we think this is going to happen, but you know, we don't really have a model to base it on, right?
We know from the Bible that the Earth waxes old like a garment, and I think that that's happening in ways that we don't even understand. That scientists are beginning to see hints of how it's waxing old as a garment, global warming, all of these unstable environmental conditions that we see in our world today are, I think, a result of the destabilization of laws and that God has been keeping in check, so to speak, since the time of the fall. And gradually, of course, things have been deteriorating.
Well, it kind of refers back to, I think it was Paul said, all of creation groans like a woman in childbirth.
That's
you know?
right. All the creation.
Right.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, let's move on to what seems to be a new in vogue thing now, and even for a lot of creationists, and for some people who are maybe trying to work the creationist viewpoint into a public school curriculum, and that is intelligent design. Just real quick, and anybody can jump in because I know we've all kind of looked at this a little bit. You know, what are the major tenets of intelligent design as it's maybe being put forth now by, you know, different people?
Intelligent design, I haven't really even heard of the term until recently, you know. within the past 10 years maybe, or not even that long.
Right, and I don't think I've ever heard of it either until, again, it seems like it's the new in vogue thing where we're trying to maybe merge or marry a evolutionist viewpoint with
a creationist.
a creator.
And I think that's the weakness. I think when we, as creationists, or even people that are involved in the intelligent design movement that are not creationist, are trying to use intelligent design as a platform to question the major tenets of evolution. But I think the only way you can really attack what I would consider to be false science is to attack it with true science. And I think that true science, this may seem like heresy, actually does involve God. And I think that that's the mistake that scientists make. They say, we're going to call the rules of science the rules saying that no God can be involved, no miracles can be involved, and if you bring any theory that calls into effect miracles or God, it's not science, and we're not going to accept it. And moreover than that, we're going to call you a religious fanatic. But you know what? What do you give me in return? You give me the Big Bang model. You give me a singularity instead of a miracle. Do you know what a singularity is? It's a scientific, fancy way of saying miracle. A singularity is the instantaneous suspension of known physical law for no reason. But yet the Big Bang is the definition. The beginning of the Big Bang defines a singularity.
Right.
And any cosmologist that knows anything will agree to that, because there is no explanation what happened before the Big Bang. It's all the part of, you know, what kind of model you want to accept. Just because we believe in God, and just because we believe that God is in charge of these singularities, that somehow makes us a religious fanatic.
Right.
And we can't call that science. Well, I don't buy that.
Right.
And I'm not going to buy it.
Right.
And so I think that, you know, we need to stand up to what we feel like, well, to me, intelligent design should be better labeled the scientific evidence for creation by God as illustrated in the Bible.
Doesn't that? But doesn't this intelligent design concept hearken to this age we're living in postmodern civilization, where the New Age theories of a universal spirit, where you know, many avenues reach to heaven. This idea that it doesn't matter what religion you have. You know, it sort of genericizes the idea of God, whatever God means, to your religion.
I'm going to come from the other side of that, maybe from the devil's advocate position about intelligent design, and say that I think some people are using intelligent design to try to remove the whole debate about is it God or not, so that they can get past the being labeled a religious fanatic, but say the evidence is there to support an intelligence behind the design of the universe, the earth, and the living things that we see. And they aren't purporting what that intelligent design is. And to me, that's where we step in and say, well, we've tried to been telling you that for hundreds of years, where this intelligence is that made this design. So I don't think all of intelligent design is some subversive
politically
thing.
correct.
Right. I think some of it is it's a scientists that maybe aren't Christian or want to remove themselves from being labeled as religious fanatics and say, let's look at the evidence. Here's what the evidence supports. It doesn't support a gradual evolution. There's design behind everything you see, and here's why.
But I think, you know, ultimately, though, what we are is shortchanging God if we fully buy into the intelligent design to say that God has to work within, you know, certain laws that He put forth, a framework. Yeah. And I think God does. I mean, but we can't shortchange God to say that He can't. To say that, you know, the cool thing about creation that He spoke things into existence, I think, is one of the coolest things that, you know, that God could do. I mean, that's just really, really neat. Real quick, how much do, Dr. Dave, ultimately, how much do you think we as Christians truly can expect to prove through science?
Oh, that's...
Well, if you can answer that in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I want to say that through science, we can use signs just like Jesus used evidence in the Bible to show the Jews that were living at the time that He was living that He was the Messiah. We can use science today in the same way that He used the evidence of His miracles to show that He was the Christ. They rejected those miracles, even though He raised Lazarus from the dead. The evidence is before us in the Polonium Halos that the rocks, the primordial basement granite rocks of the earth, were called into existence. Are we going to accept that evidence, or are we going to back off from it and fold our hands?
While ultimately our Christian faith is just that, faith, it's comforting to know that we can also simply look around at the world around us for assurance that God is there. In Romans 1, verse 20, it says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." You know, the fingerprints of God as a divine creator are all around us. From the grandeur of the universe to the atomic realm of granite halos, we see evidence that we are not here by mistake or chance, but instead as a result of a creator God. If you still have unanswered questions, which I'm sure most of you probably do, I would encourage you to visit Dr. Gentry's website at www.halos.com, where you'll find plenty of additional information, including scientific papers, books, and several very informative videos that outline his ongoing research. I want to thank my co-host, Chris Lang. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Very interesting topics.
Yeah, I know. It's just
learning experience.
It's been awesome. And my contributing editor, Dave Johnson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
That was a great time.
And, of course, our very special guest, Dr. David Gentry.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. For Hope on Fire, I'm Rick Mann, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Hope on Fire is produced by Livestreams Media, a listener-supported ministry. To download a free copy of today's program or be a part of our social network, please visit our website at hopeonfire.org. You may also contact us by writing to Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860. Once again, that's Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860, or online at hopeonfire.org. Thank you so much for your letters and continued support. Until next time, may God set your hope on fire.